Yeah, so what we're going to look at, Andrew, is this model here called the motivation model. And this is a version of the ACAS motivation model. And let's just bring up the two axes. I think it's obviously important we know what those are. So first off, on the left-hand side here, we have intention to commit. So this is all about how genuinely committed is a person to the organization in which they currently work. And along the bottom, we have willingness to reach potential. And there's a lot that we'll go on to talk about actually, do people understand their own potential? So what we're going to do, we're going to work through each of those boxes. So you'll see inactive, passenger, lost opportunity, and highly engaged, one by one, and just talk about the virtues of each one, the challenges and opportunities that we have in each one as well.
I don't see virtues in one or two of them, but maybe there are.
So why don't we start bottom left then? So bottom left, we have what I'm calling here is inactive, somebody who has, low willingness to reach potential and who has a low intention to commit. So for me, I'm thinking, is this somebody who is stuck somehow? Is this somebody who's lost? Is this somebody who's questioning to themselves, who am I? What makes me happy? And in fact, who makes me happy? I think when you're in this space about being inactive, you potentially feel a bit uncared for, missed out, unloved. And I think the what am I trying to achieve is absolutely important. But I think the who around me makes me happy is equally important. And that brings in this whole question of when we recruit, having the right team with people that you can bounce off,
True. I think so, Robert, and I think you're being very kind, by the way. You're clearly a very kindly person. I'm a bit more old and gnarled, and I think one reason people are inactive is not just because they're looking to find their way. It could be because they're looking for an easy berth.
Well, they could. I mean, for me, that what you described there, I'm thinking maybe is more the passenger potentially, because I'm thinking from an inactive point of view. Actually, who's saying they're inactive? Does their manager, leader observe that they're inactive and actually go and do something about it?
Good point.
Or a bit like the passenger, do we just leave them to get on with it and leave them to the side and everything will be okay?
I know we haven't gone there yet, and you'll take us there. I suppose the difference between the inactive and the passenger is they both have a low willingness to reach potential, but one of them intends to stay. The inactive, for me, looks like someone who doesn't have a high intention to stay, so they might only stay until they're found out.
Yeah, and I agree. They might also, and this is the bit to say, well, actually, how do we transition somebody out of this space?
Absolutely.
From that point of saying, well, actually, the real challenge here is getting somebody to commit from having no intention or little intention to commit.
Sure.
And I think pivoting out of this space, Andrew, the starting point is to have an honest, open conversation. Observer to this employee, manager to employee, leader to employee. What have I seen? What have I observed? Tell me more about where you are. That whole vulnerability piece from both sides. I think the vulnerability from the person who is inactive to admit they're inactive and I need help, but also the vulnerability of the person who's observing them to just open up that conversation too.
Oh yeah, there is a lot in this. We knew this to be so because we've talked it through. We haven't over-rehearsed, I think that's obvious, but we have prepared thoroughly. And then one of the things I know we've discussed is how willing, if you like, is an inactive person to make themselves known? If they're getting away with the anxiety, the realization that they're really not in the space they want to be, maybe they want to be in a high potential box, but they're not able to get there. Are they going to make a fuss when they've only just arrived? And how vulnerable is it for them to say, I need help here. I don't want to be inactive.
Yeah, I think that I think there's a broad assumption that inactive people want to be inactive. I just wonder how many actually are happy being inactive and how many are putting up the sign for help,
That's interesting because it's too easy to jump to a generalization. Oh, inactive people are choosing to be, but I like that challenge you've given there. Maybe there's some unwilling the inactive people. And what does inactivity mean in actual operational terms, do you think, Robert? What does an inactive employee look like that makes them different from the other people in these boxes?
I think inactive, similar to what we'll come on to talk about on passenger, that kind of just doing enough to get by.
Sure.
But also I think there's a lot in the kind of physical aspects of an inactive person, you know, how they present themselves, how they carry themselves, how they show themselves in conversations, and, you know, downbeat potentially more than upbeat. So I think there's a lot in that to tell if somebody's inactive or not just what's their output, what's their productivity, what's their return, what's their, you know, what's their workload, all those kind of things. But
I see what you're saying, because this could be an inactive person on day one, or it could be an active person on day quite a bit more, but not as long as somebody's been a passenger.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Brings us nicely into passenger, I think, Andrew, now. So, you know, low willingness to achieve, but a high intention to commit. So again, where does that leave us? What do we mean when we look at passenger? I think this refers to somebody who, and I'm going to call it, flies under the radar. You know, isn't under any scrutiny, you know, clocks in, clocks out. I'm not saying that all organizations ought to have people who want to kick on, develop, promote, get promoted, be on the next project group, or whatever it might be, but we need the happy as I am group of people in all organizations. You know what, I'm happy doing a great job to a great extent and in a great way on a continuous basis. That's fine. But it's important that they're not ignored and the balance isn't tipped towards having passengers.
Interesting, because, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm familiar with it, because intention to commit is different to reaching potential, in as much that the commitment is to stay where they are. The commitment is to go nowhere else. And if the passenger is saying to themselves, I've been here 18 years, it's somewhere that I'm comfortable and I'm not bursting an internal organ, no one's found me out yet, they might be in a senior management position. Sometimes if you've got passengers who are contaminating, I'm coming at this from the nasty angle, you're a nice man. If you've got passengers, there's different types of all of these people. I've seen passengers in organizations that have just dug themselves a nice, easy berth and are committed to staying in the organization, but they got no interest whatsoever in their own or other people's potential.
Yeah, yeah. And for businesses, it's really important. And the question here is, how do you know how many passengers you're carrying? How do you know? And, you know, you can have instinct, gut feel, observation,
sure,
you know, versus, you know, questioning, feedback, authentic listening, engagement surveys, feedback forums, you know, in terms of where we are. So you can gauge this on a very more informal basis, or engage this on a more formal basis. I mean, you could ask any leader at any point in time, rattle me off the top 3 people you believe you've got in this company who are passengers, and everyone will come up with 3, and they'll come up with more than that.
Yeah, I think so. And some of these people are quite savvy, aren't they? And I'm rather disappointed in myself that I'm coming at this from a rather jaundiced point of view, because there is a positive take on this. It's about saying, hey, before people become passengers, don't let your inactive people get into that space. They could be moving rightwards. So I think passengers, harder to turn around than inactive, probably for me, because they've been there longer.
Yeah, absolutely. But the key to this, I mean, we talk about communication and listening and 2 ears, 1 mouth, and authentic listening, and communication and listening. We generally still don't do enough, or create enough time to do that in order to deal with passengers inactive. Again, leads us nicely on to our third one, which is...
Before you go there, and the last thing I'm going to say on this, because I know you want to go, and, you know, we're being conscious of time, this is going to be a 20 minutes or so conversation rather than a 50-minute one. I think what's also occurring to me, and sometimes this only happens when you talk about it like this, I don't think people often choose to be in those 2 boxes we talked about. They don't come into an organization saying, right, here I am, I'm going to spend 20 years doing as little as possible. They actually want to be in the right-hand boxes where you're now taking us.
I agree with that. I agree with that, because inherently, if you're going to take a view that I'm going to join an organization and I'm going to keep under radar, do as little as possible, well, actually, you can't be happy. Surely you can't be happy doing that. You know, everyone wants to seek happiness, whether it's in work, out of work, and work's such a high proportion of what we do and how we spend our time. It's got to be a happy place.
It's not fulfilling, is it?
No, it's absolutely not fulfilling.
Go on then, lead us rightward. Be positive. I can get positive about these.
Right, so lost opportunity then. So high willingness to reach potential, but a low willingness to commit. And I wonder whether in this box, this isn't a classic example of, I want to do as well as I can. I believe I've got potential. I believe I've got something to offer here, but I can't do it with this business because of culture, values, ways of working, whatever it might be, or a lack of confidence in the leadership of your line manager that they will support you to allow you to reach your potential in this business. So I wonder if it's just a classic case of right person, wrong business.
I think it could be that, and I think it could be lots of other things. And this is the problem with such a simple model that provides so many channels. I also think it's the box in which people are very consciously saying, I'm going to put a lot of effort into being here, but only for 5 years, only for 3 years. These days, maybe for only 1 year. If this organization doesn't merit me staying, I'm going somewhere else.
No, and that fits well into the kind of trend we've seen over the last few years of, you know, they say, oh, no such thing as one career for life anymore. Absolutely. People do move a boundary to the other extreme. You've got the gig economy.
Oh.
But then that brings in a whole different conversation about learning and developing. Well, what's the balance between learning and developing in a company for a reasonable amount of time, opposed to kind of hopping from one to the other too regularly?
Yeah. And I think, you know, taking a 40-year retrospective, as I now can on working in workplaces, it often disappoints me that line managers who you would expect to have a closeness of relationship, to be aware of the aspirations of their people, are totally surprised when someone hands in the resignation. Robert, why are you going? And Robert thinks to himself, you should bloody well know, because we've nearly had that conversation lots of times. You're not interested. If a line manager is close enough to the aspirations, ambitions, and hopes of their people, they will not cause people to think they should leave an organization they could stay in and do well in.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, this whole kind of knowing and being close, I mean, there's definitely an element of size of business that comes into this. You know, you've got a business with 12 people, you'd fully expect the finger to be on the pulse of each of those 12 people very closely, compared to one with 12,000, you know? Yeah,
I think there's an excuse in there somewhere, but there's also a reason. We better go top right. I know we're moving fast.
Yeah, just one final thing on lost opportunity. I think it's important for us to say, well, actually, what's the cost here? What's the cost of lost opportunity? You know, it's financial, it's productivity, it's customer experience, it's reputation. And I think, you know, at the moment, organizational reputation is more important today than it's ever been. You know, we have a shortage of labor. We have a shortage of quality people out there to fill gaps. I think reputation is key, and this whole idea of, I want to commit, but it's not the right fit based on your values and principles and everything is really important. So let's move on then. Final box, highly engaged. So high intent to commit, high willingness to reach potential. So I thought about this and thought, you can't be highly engaged all the time. I think it's virtually impossible to be highly engaged all the time, but there are employees and businesses who are highly engaged most of the time. And I wonder that if there are risks here, and this whole idea that, well, if you're highly engaged, I don't need to do anything with you, you just crack on, I'll deal with the passengers on the inactive and the lost opportunities. But I think we shouldn't forget the highly engaged here, because often those are the go-to people. And those are the go-to people for things like, they're the people pleasers. I'm highly engaged. I want to get involved. Give me more to do. Give me stuff to do. Get me on this group, that group, whatever. But I think there's also a danger that we can burn out those highly engaged people.
Absolutely.
So I think the performance needs to be managed very proactively, but also to ensure that we're focusing on the right things, that we're being output focused opposed to activity focused.
I think so. I can see again, line managerially, how each of these boxes can be quite intense and requiring quite a bit of concern and interest, because the concern and interest you show someone in the top right box is very different to that you show in the top left box.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of feeling that if you don't get, as you're saying, and I think you're right, if you don't get the subtlety and the concern and the right way to engage the highly engaged, they could slip back into being passengers to say, okay, I used to be right up for this place, but not anymore. I'm going to see my 5 years out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so back to the whole, if I was to overarch this with one thing, it would be maintenance of dialogue and communication, Andrew. You know, I'm not for labeling things, and I know for the purposes of this we have labeled it, but I
like labels.
it's important. It's really important that, you know, when we sit back and we think of people in our organizations, that we use potentially those 4 labels in order to help us to say, well, actually, they need a particular approach, and they need a particular approach, and so do they, and them. So, so it's a really fascinating area, particularly now. You know, businesses can't afford inactive and passenger for all sorts of obvious reasons. But I think the whole values piece is important, Andrew, as well. You know, we've talked about before values, and we've talked about behaviors and values-based leadership, and certainly that's something that I'm really interested in looking at more, and something that you and I should talk on one of these about on a more detailed basis, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And as we're coming to a close, it's so easy to reopen debate. So I think you're absolutely right in summarising that. And I think my reflection on observation of operational management is there's a lot that can still be done to create that dialogue you're talking about, to have less surprises. And you don't want, you've got people in each box. Typically there's an imbalance. And can you pull people from one side to the other? It's degrees of. Not everyone's right at the extreme of highly engaged or right down the bottom of inactive. You can pull people about. And I wonder if it's also contextual, situational. There's so many takes we can make on this. I'm not going to open those boxes further, because you're right. It's all about dialogue. Well, I think we've achieved something there. I hope that's given people something to go away and use.
Great conversation, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.